I'm going to be delivering a talk here that is not particularly an academic talk. I want to speak in very general terms about some of the themes and questions that go into my work on censorship. And I'll be bringing it up to date a little bit as well in terms of some things that have happened since my book was published in 2013. Now, I'm sure you've often heard the following kind of statement offered as if it were a paradox. It goes something like this. India is the largest democracy in the world, but out of 180 countries, it ranks 136th for press freedom. Or something like this. India has the largest film business in the world, but also one of the most draconian systems of censorship. Any number of articles in the press use these kind of statements as jumping off points. Like an article in The Independent this last March that began, "It sounds like an oxymoron, the world's largest democracy," and notice how they put largest democracy in quotation marks, "routinely curtails freedom of expression, but it's the truth." Statements like these are based on a conventional understanding of what censorship is for, what censorship does. George Bernard Shaw expressed it like this: "Censorships exist to prevent anyone from challenging current conceptions and existing institutions." Now, of course, there's some truth to this. There is a policing dimension to censorship. There is a way in which censorship is about silencing and about controlling, but we only have to look at what goes on in India, and in fact, in the rest of the world too, to notice something quite odd about this. Censorship seems to be flourishing despite the fact that the censors are quite clearly not able to silence or to control a great deal of our public cultural space. So maybe something else is going on. Maybe we need to think differently about what the censors are up to. I want to be quite clear on one thing before I get into this. It's not that I don't think that free speech is a good thing. Now, clearly it is, and clearly it's strategically important given that we live in times of great intolerance for all of us to do everything we can to make sure that we have as much room as possible in which to speak and to breathe. But I do want to suggest that we let go of this question of the silencing of speech for a moment in order to understand censorship a bit better. And the first step towards understanding censorship a little bit better is to recognize that censorship is itself a kind of publicity. I'll be saying more about that in a little bit, but for now I just want to put that thought on the table. Censorship is itself a kind of publicity. Censorship thrives on visibility. We may think that censorship is about drawing a veil over things, about not mentioning, about not showing, but you only need to consider the fact that acts of censorship are themselves publicized, and that the supposedly unspeakable thing is again and again spoken by the censors themselves to justify why they had to silence it. Okay, so this has been a busy year for Indian censorship controversies. Only last month, in November, filmmaker Shyam Benegal again came out with a blanket demand that film censorship should be abolished altogether. Benegal's call to action comes at a time when there's a great deal of renewed concern about intolerance and repression in public life, and especially in the arts. In the last year, the government has blocked internet sites, notably porn sites, and it has threatened to revoke the broadcasting licenses of television news stations that have aired critical points of view. Other media and other sites of cultural production have come under renewed pressure, often through various kinds of activist and pressure groups that are in more or less roundabout ways linked to established political parties. Now, of course, the legal and technical aspects of television and internet censorship are separate from what happens with film, and the theater is again quite a different kind of beast. I'm not going to try and speak across all these different media. Many of you probably know more about the latest developments in some of these areas than I do. I want to be focusing on film censorship since that's a topic on which I published this book in 2013 called Censoring, Cinema and the Open Edge of Mass Publicity. All right, having said that I'll be focusing on film censorship, I would also say that thinking film censorship inevitably means thinking censorship in general. And hopefully what I mean by this will become clearer in the next few minutes. Now, this is a booklet that the Film Censor Board here in India puts out. And I just want to point to the delightful coy question mark at the end of the subtitle. what everyone should know, maybe, maybe not. During the past year, there's been a great deal of unrest and controversy in and around the Indian Film Censor Board, which since the 1980s has been formally and somewhat euphemistically known as the Central Board of Film Certification, or CBFC for short. The current chair of the censor board, Prahlad Nihalani, has come in for criticism for what an article in the Times of India called his, quote, unilateral decision-making style and cavalier attitude. Raghu Menon, a former Secretary of Information and Broadcasting and censor board member, has publicly complained about Nihalani's high-handedness, comparing it unfavorably with Vijay Anand's earlier tenure in the early 2000s. But let's not forget that Vijay Anand himself was basically forced to resign quite bitterly in 2002 after his reform proposals proved a provocation too far for the then BJP-led national government. For many years, the complaint has been that the censor board effectively operates as a patronage opportunity for whatever government is in power at a given time. That the members of the advisory panels in each regional center, that is to say, that many of the folks who watch and evaluate the films for the censor board are basically political appointees who have no real business sitting in judgment on films. This is what people complain. As documentary filmmaker Rakesh Sharma, who's a long-term critic of the censor board, acidly remarked in 2005, the examining committees usually represent a wide cross-section of society, sarcasm, a minister's girlfriend or his unemployed nephew, a local corporator's convent-educated wife, some MLA's campaign accountant who helped him hoodwink the Election Commission's regulation, a Jai Shri Ram chant-enthused party worker from the BJP, VHP, Bajrang Dal, Hindu Jagran Manch, Durga Vahini, or one of Sonia Ji's congressmen. As associates or chamchas of some politician, they have a rare intellectual depth, a deep understanding of culture and aesthetics, and an even deeper understanding of the dark sides of the human soul. Since they also happen to possess expertise in constitutional matters, they can swiftly figure out whether a dialogue will cause a law and order problem and breach peace faster than any court of law, as they only have 3 to 4 hours to do so, while any court can drag on a case for years. Now, in fact, although the publicized version of Vijay Anand's resignation made it seem as if it was all about his proposal to introduce X-rated cinemas in Indian cities, several people have argued that what actually proved unpalatable to the government was that Anand was trying to resist this kind of political interference in the censorship process, this kind of stacking of the censor board and its advisory panels. In that regard, it's telling that one of the complaints against Nihalani in the last year has been that he's so obviously a supporter of the Prime Minister, calling the Prime Minister an action hero and producing a promotional film for him. Another member of the censor board, filmmaker Ashok Pandit, has been quoted in the press complaining that the chair of the film censor board should not also appear to be producing government propaganda. And in fact, in January of this year, the former censor board chair, Leela Sampson, ended her term in a very public flurry of accusations about political interference and the corruption of the censoring process. Okay, so there's a lot more to say about what we might really be imagining when we imagine a non-corrupt or non-problematic censorship process. First of all, this presumes that there could be something calm and rational about censorship, such that it could follow calm and rational rules. But the very core of the censoring impulse has to do with agitation and its risks and possibilities. Censorship is inherently about intensities rather than about principles, no matter how many rules and regulations and procedures and norms the censors claim to be following. Since the 1920s and even earlier, the censors have always loved to draw up lists. The 48 things that are not allowed, the 97 things that are not allowed. These lists are then updated and revised every so often. But the point is that censorship is not just about the what, as it's more about the how. It's not about, say, the kiss as such, but what a particular kiss insinuates and implies. And insinuations and implications are virtual. They can't be pre-specified in the form of lists. So earlier this year, we were treated to a delightful illustration of the comedy of the censors' lists when a list of objectionable words, internally circulated by the censor board chair, leaked out and started appearing on websites, much to general public amusement. But it illustrates the point I've been trying to make about how the censors remain stuck between the idea that they can pre-enumerate everything that mustn't be shown, and, on the other hand, that what is really objectionable is not something you can specify in terms of content, but rather something more implied or insinuated, right? So when Mr. Nihalani accepted the job of censor chief in early 2015, he announced that he was going to run a tight ship on which all the members of the advisory panels would have regular workshops so that they would know exactly what was and what wasn't permitted. But, as this list illustrates, the problem is that you can't specify obscenity. You can't specify offense in advance. This is why the efforts that we see from time to time to reform censorship in such a way as to make it more precise are doomed to fail, because the problem is not precision. The problem is emergence. It's not just that words have double meanings, but that their meanings emerge unpredictably in context and depend on things like the lighting of the scene and the posture, the tone, the gestures of the actor uttering the words, not to mention what's going on in the mind of the person watching. How does anyone know that an insinuation is there if you can't actually point to it in the word or the image? Because you feel it, it's palpable, or, perhaps more precisely, you worry that other people might be feeling it. It's like what a US Supreme Court judge once famously said about obscenity. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. And of course, in the Indian context, the supposed evidence that all this is not just the prurient anxiety of some middle-class lady or gent on the censor board is the way that the so-called front benchers behave in the cinema halls. And this is always referred to, the whooping, the catcalling, the jeering, right? In colonial days, this kind of behavior was supposed to be evidence of racial difference. Indians, as one European member of colonial civil society remarked in the late 1920s, were simply more prone to be excited by the gestural quality of the image. And this is what he said, and this is from the Indian Cinematograph Committee proceedings. You have got a peculiarly constituted people, this is referring to Indians, they're intensely dramatic in thought and action. When you see a coolie and talk to him, you realize how intensely dramatic he is. Their language is a very graphic language, much more than the Western. Another British resident of that period described the palpable sense of prurience that seemed to hang in the air even when no one was making any noise in the cinema hall. He said, when there is anything suggestive on the screen, there's often a sort of hushed silence and suppressed ecstasy over the suggestion. So these days, the censors don't talk in terms of racial differences anymore. Nowadays, it's supposed to be a matter of education or literacy. This is why, even though the censor board is, by its own statutes, supposed to be made up of a cross-section of society and interests, that's the phrase they use, it's never actually going to include auto rickshaw drivers or milk sellers. Some years ago, when I asked the then Mumbai regional officer of the censor board why not, he was genuinely horrified and responded, but such a man might go out and do what he saw in the film. So the idea that illiterate or otherwise unsophisticated people are, as it were, entirely and helplessly porous to the image that they might see, that they're actually much like children, right, is deeply embedded in the discourse of censorship. One hears it repeated again and again. And once again, when it comes to censorship, the so-called proof of the need for censorship is the behavior of the non-elite sections in the cinema hall. And yet it's interesting that amid all this affect, all this anxiety, and all this agitation, some people still cultivate the idea that censorship can be a rational and a reasonable process. This fantasy rears its head, especially when activist groups decide to take the law into their own hands and attack some theater screening a controversial film or cause some other kind of havoc. When that happens, you have the curious spectacle of people who the day before were vehemently objecting to film censorship, suddenly upholding the legitimacy of the censor certificate against the illegality of so-called informal censorship. Now, we saw this, for instance, in the late 90s with the street attacks on a film like Deepa Mehta's Fire. Now, clearly, you can't have it both ways. Either the censor certificate is legitimate or it isn't. Just because the censors passed your film without too many cuts doesn't mean that their certificate suddenly has legitimacy, if you're not going to accept its legitimacy when they want to chop your film to bits. Similarly, if you're a filmmaker who objects to censorship on principle, then it's a bit odd to start complaining that the censors didn't follow due process in the evaluation of your film. Obviously, I understand how frustrating it is for filmmakers to be messed around by the censor board and to have their films become footballs in some political game that has nothing to do with them and nothing to do with their films. But I do think it's worth pondering this kind of ambivalent, schizophrenic way in which 1 minute we say that censorship as such is illegitimate, and then the next minute we complain that the proper legalities of the censorship process aren't being followed. There's a deep ambivalence there about censorship and its relation to the rule of law that could do with some closer examination, I think. This ambivalence comes up again in the internal skirmishes that we've seen in the censor board during the past year. So, when people on the censor board have accused Pahlaj Nihalani of acting in an arbitrary and despotic way, then they're implying that there could be another kind of censorship that would be reasonable and democratic. I understand the need for the fantasy, but I would say that it has very little to do with how censorship ever has or ever could operate, because ultimately, censorship presumes unlimited sovereign authority. This has always been the case, and it continues to be so. In the colonial period, censorship laws would often carefully specify the terms under which films, plays, or books might be regulated. But then, again, one of those things, the list and the exception, right? And the list and the thing that falls outside the list. So they'd specify all these things in which, these ways in which the things to be regulated. But then the statutes would conclude with a phrase like, or any other circumstance as the authorities may see fit to determine, right? Even today, the formula that specifies how obscenity is to be judged in India hinges on the term tendency. Obscenity is not so much a given property of a text or an image, but is rather a kind of unpredictable potential that has to be anticipated, a tendency. And how does one judge a tendency? This, by the way, is one of the places where I actually think that the censorship law is more intelligent than it itself knows. Another example of this fantasy of reasonable censorship is the way that filmmakers in India often say that they would like a US style of certification or system of certification instead of a censor board that demands cuts. According to at least one report, Nihalani himself has approached the authorities to recommend such a reform. Now, here the fantasy for the filmmaker is that you will get to make the film that you want to make, and you yourself take responsibility for what kind of audiences will then be allowed to see it. I think Indians often tend to imagine kindly that institutions in other parts of the world function more rationally and more fairly than they do in India. But the fact is, as Kirby Dick shows in a highly illuminating documentary called This Film Is Not Yet Rated, that the US ratings process too operates in an extremely shadowy way. The public doesn't get to know who the examiners are. There's very little consistency in their evaluations and their demands. And filmmakers often find themselves forced to accept cuts in order to get the certificate they want, with little or no possibility of appeal or redress. Again, I think what needs to be questioned here is this desire we seem to have for a kind of censorship without censorship, a kind of reasonable and just regulatory agency, a kind of paternal authority that would actually be fair. So one of the arguments that I make in the book, Censoring, is that film censorship is in so many ways quite obviously ridiculous, and that's precisely why we need to take it seriously, right? It's almost as if the censors presume that we're going to think that what they're saying is ridiculous and that we'll dismiss it. And that's why it deserves a second look. Something that the French thinker René Girard once wrote about sacrifice could just as well have been said about censorship. He said, "First appearances count for little, are quickly brushed aside, and should therefore receive special attention." Even the language of censorship seems to solicit our hilarity, all these baroque and outmoded phrases about moral turpitude and so on. When we're not simply infuriated with them, perhaps the censors hide behind our laughter. Censorship itself often seems plenty funny, albeit in a rather dark kind of way. Or maybe we're only laughing because we presume that censorship is so ridiculous. Actually, as soon as you venture out into the blogosphere or start checking out the comments sections of online articles, it becomes pretty clear that a lot of ordinary people really do seem to believe in censorship. Unless the censor board are the ones who are posting all these comments. I'm not sure, it could be. A lot of folks really do support the idea that we need censorship in order to prevent the unraveling of our culture, the corruption of our mores, and all that kind of thing. There's a lot of agitation online, for example, about vulgarity, a term that it's worth remembering actually derives from the Latin word vulgus, a word that means the common people. In other words, to speak critically of vulgarity in a democracy is implicitly paternalistic and condescending. We're passing aesthetic judgment on the preferences and tastes of people we are calling inferior when we use the word vulgar. It's worth pondering, actually, how often in censorship debates we conflate moral considerations with aesthetic values. In my own research for the book, I very often came across what I decided, perhaps a bit floridly, to call the enunciator's exception. Now, the enunciator's exception, and I don't think I'll repeat that phrase again, don't worry. The enunciator's exception, there I just did, is when people say, I'm sure you've heard this often enough, censorship is necessary, but not for me, not for people like us. Almost always, those who believe in censorship believe that it's necessary for others, others who are supposedly more susceptible to provocation than they themselves are. And the flip side of this is another kind of statement that I also came across very frequently. Someone I was interviewing would open the conversation by saying that they didn't believe in censorship and talk in that vein for a while. Then suddenly, a qualification would intrude. You know I don't believe in censorship, but unfortunately in a country like India, I do believe that it is necessary. Here again, the idea that there are other parts of the world in which people behave with proper civic restraint and rationality, where they can be trusted to be reasonable citizens. I think only the briefest look at what's going on in European and North American political culture will call that fondly held canard into question. But of course, the point here is that whether one thinks the lower orders need it, or whether one thinks that a society like India, whatever that means, needs it, the idea of censorship becomes a way to shore up the paternalistic authority of a governing class by insisting that the vast majority are incapable, or maybe just not quite ready to govern themselves. Now, this paternalistic attitude is, of course, deeply rooted in the whole self-image of the Indian state. In the post-independence period, it takes responsibility for developing and uplifting the Indian masses. And in doing so, it needed to reassure itself that the proper expertise, the proper judicious attitude towards social ills was on the side of the state. But this kind of paternalism is also structural, and this becomes starkly visible when we're talking about censorship. As one former member of the censor board has remarked, the moment you're on the censor board, you become righteous. You feel the weight of society's morals on your shoulders. You stop shrugging. The current chair, Mr. Nihalani, is, as many people have pointed out, a good example of this. As a veteran filmmaker, he has, over the years, shot scenes that would no doubt fall foul of his own rules as head of the censor board. Now, it would be easy to call this kind of thing hypocrisy. And there's certainly many quite amusing examples from the annals of censorship to support such an interpretation. And I can't resist just mentioning one example that also shows up in my book. Starting in 1992, Indians could make phone calls to exorbitantly expensive sex lines in Hong Kong and elsewhere. All this resulted in an unexpected windfall for BSNL, the government's international communications gateway. But in 1998, the then Information and Broadcasting Minister, Sushma Swaraj, tried to put an end to this depravity And for some months, the government employed people to play whack-a-mole with new phone sex lines, keeping track of new numbers as they popped up and then blocking them. But by 2000, VSNL had reopened access, citing an annual revenue loss on the order of more than $1 million US. And more pertinently, from the point of view of the hypocrisy theme, and perhaps more embarrassingly, it was found that about 65% of the calls were being made from telephones installed in government offices and official residences. Now, you laugh, but yes, of course, it's always satisfying to see the moralists hoisted on their own petards, but perhaps the point actually is not just the obvious one about moral hypocrisy, but also that there's something structural about the censor's gaze. You tend to find what you're looking for, and you find it, first of all, at home. Critics often complain that the censors are inconsistent, right? What is banned in one film gets through in another. Things that aren't on the censor's lists are cut, whereas things that are on the list stay in. Even the censors themselves admit that if they were to follow the guidelines literally and to the letter, then what we now recognize as popular Indian cinema simply couldn't exist. Again, the critic's desire here seems to be, if we're going to have censorship, at least let it be consistent. At least let us know what to expect. At least let us have rules that make sense. So take the example of the skirmish around the Godman Gurmeet's film, Messenger of God. The film was refused a certificate by the Censor Board's revising committee because it was thought to promote blind faith and superstition, and because the committee worried that it might hurt the religious sentiments of certain groups. And in fact, there had been some advance protests from Sikh groups. Now, the issue about superstition in the case of Messenger of God appeared to hinge on the fact that Gurmeet, as an actual living historical person, was shown performing miracles. For example, curing terminal diseases, and also, mixing up the story a bit, that the film seemed to amount to a kind of ad for his movement. There also seemed to be some discomfort about the fact that Gurmeet was being portrayed as a miracle worker at a time when he was being investigated by the CBI for allegedly ordering several hundred of his followers to undergo castration. Now, you can already see how all this plays into the censor's publicity game. Even just using a term like castration has all eyes glued to the news item. Anyway, at the time, a member of the censor board was quoted in the press saying that all this superhuman stuff would have been fine if the protagonist had been fictional, if it had been, say, a superhero. They specified Superman, by the way. That's not gratuitous. One wonders how this logic maps onto the long tradition of Indian mythological films and television programs, and the often fondly recounted blurring of the boundary between actor and deity, fact and fiction. One might also consider the superhuman stature and aura that surrounds many leading film heroes, particularly in South India. More generally, one might want to ask how cleanly the line can be drawn between so-called religious and so-called secular forms of devotion, and why one is called irrational and superstitious when the other is indulgently accommodated as fandom. So going back to colonial times, there's been a more or less unspoken tendency to censor films differently depending on their audiences, and especially depending on whether their audiences are thought to be educated or not. And here, the English language often functions as a kind of shorthand for educated, so that the English language versions of films have often gotten away with far fewer cuts than the versions dubbed into Indian languages. One example of this in the 1990s was Meera Nair's Kama Sutra, which suffered far more at the hands of the censors in its Hindi version than in its English version. And of course, films originally made in Indian languages have often been treated more severely than Hollywood films. At one level, justification for this double standard has tended to be the one I've already discussed, that so-called uneducated audiences don't have the prophylaxis that education, read English medium education, supposedly offers against mimetic seduction in the screen. But it gets more peculiar than that. Again, since colonial times, the thinking has sometimes been that one would allow, say, a kiss in a Hollywood film, irrespective of whether what kind of Indian audiences were watching that Hollywood film, and one would allow it because, the argument went, people kiss publicly in the United States, i.e., here the claim is that it's part of the culture being depicted in the film. Just as it's often argued that gangsters in Hindi films have to be allowed to swear a lot because that's just the way that criminals talk. But if some classes of the audience are inherently supposed to be permeable to bad words or sexy images, then how will the fact that it's the culture of the fictional characters being depicted on screen protect the spectators, who aren't Americans or Europeans, and let's not cast aspersions, who aren't necessarily criminals? How will all this stop them from being corrupted by the film? In any case, recent events suggest that the cultural difference argument is not a reliable rule either. A few weeks ago, as I'm sure you all remember, the new James Bond film Spectre had its kissing scenes trimmed by 50%. Now, of course, this is in itself yet more ammunition for those who would argue that the censors are bureaucratic bores with no understanding of the finer points of film aesthetics. The fact that one would simply and crudely chop by quantitative measure half, we'll have half of that scene, thank you, rather than paying any attention to what impact that might have on the aesthetic framing or rhythm of the film as a whole. But my response to hearing the news was simply to say that evidently Sam Mendes, the director of Spectre, had failed to do his homework, since the first rule of big-budget Hollywood filmmaking is that you shoot twice as much of the sex and violence as you think you will actually need, and then allow the censor to bargain you down in return for the certificate that you want. Now, it's easy to get carried away with teasing the censors. It's just so fun, and they make themselves such easy targets. But the point is that while we're laughing, we're also not confronting the fact that it makes no sense to expect the censors to live up to what the great German sociologist Max Weber 100 years ago called legal bureaucratic legitimacy. Censorship is not about rules that can be specified in advance. Censorship is inherently not accountable. For every argument that can be made for an act of censorship, there's a counter-argument. And for that one, yet another counter-argument. A very early film censor in the United States, a man called John Collier, wrote these words back in 1915, and I used them as the epigraph to the introduction of my book. And he said, "There are always reasons to spare for every censoring act, and the inner heart cannot be placed in evidence." Censorship, then, is not about consistent rules. We cannot expect it to be predictable or reasonable. In fact, much of its power derives from its unpredictability. Censorship thrives on an appearance of arbitrariness. A little while ago, I suggested that we have to stop thinking about censorship as being just about silencing and start considering it as a kind of publicity. And I want to spend my last few minutes amplifying that proposition. And one way to start would be to invoke another one of the sociologist Max Weber's categories of legitimate authority, that is to say, charismatic authority. If censorship is not based on legal bureaucratic authority, then one could perhaps say that censorship is fundamentally and powerfully charismatic. Now, earlier I was saying that censorship always grapples with the fact that you can't specify implications and insinuations in advance, that they're contextual and emergent in a given scene or situation. That is the key problem that the censors deal with in terms of their regulatory function, or if you like, their policing function. And it's a problem that's not just, as it were, formally internal to a text or a film. It's a problem that has to do with the unpredictability of what happens when texts and films circulate, especially when they circulate in a modern mass-mediated public sphere, when the question, who exactly is watching, can never quite be answered. And there's an anxiety that inherently goes with that question. But now I want to turn that around and say that this contextual and emergent potential of images is not just something that the censors try to control, it's actually also something on which they thrive. One often hears it said that Indian censorship is based on colonial laws that are simply irrelevant in today's world, and this is my image of colonial laws that are simply irrelevant in today's world. This kind of statement makes it sound as if someone simply forgot to clean out the cupboard after the British left. It's easy to see why such an idea is attractive because it seems to explain how something so arbitrary, something so undemocratic as censorship can persist in the midst of the world's largest democracy. As a commentary on the Huffington Post website put it earlier this year, many of the laws in India that are applied to online content are outdated, relics of a colonial government with no interest in free speech. And of course, many of these same portions of the penal code having to do with obscenity, with injured sentiments, with disturbances to public order, and so on, are also applied to film and do in fact date back to the colonial period, often to the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But then one needs to ask, what work do these laws do in the present? Why is it that even as the structure of Indian film censorship was somewhat modified by the Cinematograph Act of 1952, and then a long series of updates and revisions to the guidelines and the rules, as well as the introduction of whole new bodies like the Appellate Tribunal in the 1980s, why is it that the norms that guide the judgment of offense, provocation, and obscenity remain largely intact? So one reason is the one that I've already discussed, that they have to do with the idea of a class of spectators that is inherently volatile and that needs to be protected from itself. This idea, as I mentioned, traveled from the racist colonial imagination through to the paternalism of state-led development in independent India. Now, of course, in itself, a proposition like this is just fundamentally wrong, not to mention the fact that it's incompatible with democracy. And yet, throughout the time I was doing my research, people would repeat variations on the theme to me again and again. So part of what my book is about is the question of how an idea that is so obviously wrong has such ideological staying power. Another question that rears its head is this. Before the early 1980s, one could still make the case that cinema was the big game in town in terms of media, and that from a regulatory standpoint, it made sense to focus on film. But since then, India has seen the rise of commercial television, of the video revolution, of satellite and cable TV, of commercial radio, and of course the internet and its mobile and social media spin-offs. Nowadays, even the authorities themselves admit that they're unable to exert control over all these media channels. Actually, even in the old days, the censors were never really able to fully police what was shown on cinema screens, especially outside the major metro areas. But today, there isn't even really a pretense that the control is working. It's obvious that people can easily get hold of the uncut versions of the films that the censors are still busy snipping, and the censors know that. So what could possibly be the justification for holding on to the old censorship machinery under these conditions? So my answer to that question would be that we're actually making an elementary mistake as long as we think that film censorship is premised on watertight control. I've already suggested that part of the power of the censors lies in the unpredictability of their decisions, in the fact that no one, including they themselves, quite knows when, if, or how they'll intervene. But at a more profound level, censorship is not so much about control as it is about charismatic performance. Censorship is about the publicly visible gesture of censorship. It's a performance of authority. It thrives on visibility. This is why it doesn't really matter that in the age of the internet censorship appears to have become impossible or futile. Censorship doesn't live or die on the basis of how tightly it's able to regulate what we see, read, and hear. Rather, it lives or dies on the basis of how effectively, how provocatively it's able to mobilize our attention and even our indignation. In fact, one might say that censorship depends on our willingness to be offended, even our pleasure in being offended. What do I mean by this? Think about how censorship actually activates the power of the thing that it is ostensibly censoring. We are told again and again what it is that wasn't allowed. The supposedly prohibited act or image is endlessly invoked. Think, for instance, of all the times that we're told that a particular word has been muted or deleted in a film. Recently, there was an example of the word lesbian being muted in this way. Now, of course, the censors know that this will be reported. In fact, they want it to be reported and discussed. And in the process, all the affective potentials of the word lesbian are activated again and again. Obviously, the censors know that banning something only enhances its mystique and its desirability, only focuses its provocative power. And the censors rely on our dirty minds. They know that when a word is bleeped out, we're going to fill it in for ourselves. And if we don't fill in the exact word that was bleeped, we'll probably fill in something dirtier than the one that was bleeped. It's almost as if the censors are trying to make sure that the provocative potential of the controversial scene, image, or gesture is actually activated, and then, and this is the key part, and then that this provocative potential is, as it were, seized by the governing authorities to fuel their own charismatic ambition. Rather than thinking of censorship as being all about silencing, then, I would argue that we think of it as a two-step game of what I would call incitement and containment. First, the censors incite or activate the provocative potential of the image. Then they do their best to contain that provocation. And by contain, I don't mean muffle or silence, but rather something like what an ad does when it channels the excitement of a particular sexy model or provocative gesture into the charisma of the brand that it's advertising. In fact, we could say that the censors are actually, in a way, parasitic on the work that filmmakers do. It's almost as if they hijack the work, generally by extracting and foregrounding its most prurient potentials. I'm sure you've often heard filmmakers complain about the kind of tamasha that activist groups can create, but by organizing protests against a film, how they're using the film that they probably haven't even watched as a way to get public attention for their movement or their cause. But my point is that this is also what the official censors are doing, except they're doing it from the standpoint and with all the legal machinery of the ruling authorities. That is why I'm saying that we need to think of censorship as a kind of publicity, and that is why the endless complaints and op-eds about intolerance and moral policing will only get us so far. For sure, when you're on the receiving end of a clampdown or a public act of violence, the policing is very real and certainly not to be underestimated or condoned. But if we want to understand what censorship does, how it works, then we need to start our analysis from what it is that a given act of censorship activates rather than what it silences. We need to think about which audiences are addressed by which acts of censorship and why they're addressable in those ways. And we need to think twice about our own fascination, our own susceptibility to being seduced by the great game of censorship. Thank you very much.